Well, we're in John chapter 10. John chapter 10, beginning with verse 13. As you recall, Jesus is in Judea, which is he's down in Jerusalem. He's been ministering there. We see him interacting with the Jews. They would be the established ones. They would be the ones who, as it were more formal. And it was more of a hub and a center of Judaism at that time. And lo and behold, Jesus has gone about doing his miracles again. John records them as signs again because they point to something. They're illustrative. It doesn't mean that the miracles that Jesus did in other places or in other Gospels didn't mean anything. But John, as we are told in the end of his Gospel, picked certain things, recorded certain miracles because they illustrated certain truths about Christ. And so we often find in the Gospel of John, Jesus doing a miracle and then going on to expound upon it in a way that illustrates who he is and his unique nature and his unique message and his unique mission, all being sent by God to save men. Being sent out by God, from God, of God, yet being God, to bring men back into fellowship with the Father. And so what we have again this morning demonstrated for us is exactly what we're told by John. John does an absolutely masterful job of writing this out strictly from a point of view of a literary consideration. He says back in chapter 2, Jesus didn't commit himself to these people because he knew what was in their hearts. He didn't need anyone to testify to him, to tell him what was in with man, because he already knew. So all of the conversations that Jesus has are not Jesus coming to know the person better. They're that person coming to know themselves better by interacting with Christ. That's a very important thing to remember, that there are depths to ourselves, depths to you, depths to understanding, that you cannot reach ever by yourself. But by interacting with Christ, they're drawn out and people's true conditions are made known. Well, as you've made a note of, and you definitely see, the people that Jesus seems to be having the most trouble with, the people who seem to be reviling against him and just can't stand him at all, are the people who claim to be the most religious and the people who claim to be walking the closest with God. Their external lives are ordered to that way. Everything about them screams, I am a God follower, except for their interaction with Christ. The more they interact with Christ, the more they hate him, ultimately to the place where they are willing to murder him. And so as we've been looking, we see time and time again, they just reject him, not simply because of his message. It would be one thing to hide behind that and say that they were so religious and they were upset that a man was claiming to be God. But at the heart of it, they hate him because he was God. Because as Jesus says throughout all of his sermons and all of his messages, I'm doing the same things that God the Father does. I'm doing the same thing that he did. And because I'm doing what God did, that's why you hate me. I'm here to show you that you actually hate God. Not a very popular message, but obviously a necessary one. So here in John chapter 10, he's gone and he's done another miracle. He's healed another person. And he's gone and he's done it in such a way on purpose that it's pejorative. He's trying to, as it were, force a question upon the religious people. And so he's done it in a way that purposefully violated what they consider to be the Sabbath. And so as we read on, keep that in mind. And we're going to go through just to verse 34 from verse 13. It's a bit of a chunk, but then we'll come back and it's just going to be broken up into 3 parts. So here we are. Jesus has performed the miracle. It involved a man born blind, a man blind from birth. He anoints his eyes with clay. After he's made the clay, he tells the man to go wash in the pool of Siloam. The man comes back and he can see, but he doesn't encounter Jesus. So then the inquiry begins, because a miracle has just happened, something miraculous has occurred, so they bring it before the Pharisees. So let's actually begin with verse 12. Then they said to him, where is he? He said, I do not know. They brought him, who formerly was blind, to the Pharisees. Now it was a Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also asked him again how he had received his sight. He said to them, he put clay on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. Therefore, some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath. Others said, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was a division among them. They said to the blind man again, what do you say about him because he opened your eyes? He said, He is a prophet. Verse 18, but the Jews did not believe concerning him. That is to say, they did not believe that this man was actually born blind. They didn't believe in the validity of the miracle, that he had been born blind and received his sight, until they called the parents of him who had received his sight. And they asked him, saying, is this your son, whom you say was born blind? How then does he now see? His parents answered them and said, we know that this is our son, and that he was born blind, but by what means he now sees we do not know, or who opened his eyes we do not know. He is of age, ask him, he will speak for himself. His parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had agreed already that if anyone confessed that he was Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore his parents said, he is of age, ask him. 24, so again they called the man who was blind, and he said to them, give God the glory. We know that this man is a sinner. He answered and said, whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I know, that though I was blind, now I see. Then they said to him again, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered them, I told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? Then they reviled him and said, you are his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, we do not know where he is from. The man answered and said to them, why, this is a marvelous thing. You do not know where he is from, yet he has opened my eyes. Now we know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. Since the world began, it is unheard of that anyone has opened the eyes of one who was born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. They answered and said to him, you were completely born in sins. Are you now teaching us? And they cast him out. It does get you going a little bit, doesn't it, hearing the man's response? And it's not... Sometimes when you watch people interact, you can't really tell if there's tension there, but this one, it becomes pretty clear pretty easily. And that's part of what we'll look at today. But there are three things that I want to look at in this section. We'll try to move through them as quickly as possible. And there are basically three themes that run throughout this passage. And each theme has a word that probably most closely identifies what the main point is. So the three themes are this. They are unbelief, and the word that identifies that is hindrance. The second is that of law and grace, or the flesh and the spirit. And the word that's most closely identified with that would be ability. And lastly, union with Christ, and that word would be value. So let's begin with the first, which is unbelief. We see here portrayed in the Pharisees and in the ones who want to make inquiry as to this miracle, staunch and entrenched and unyielding unbelief. And it's an amazing thing when you see it unfolding here. It's highlighting, again, as there's nothing new under the sun, as Solomon said, that there's nothing particularly special about these people in the way that they're interacting with God. As we read just in Psalm 106 there, it says, if you go on to read the rest of that psalm, and even another psalm we'll look at in just a moment, Psalm 78, there's this recurring problem of those who would not believe God. We've used it here a couple times in the past weeks of Pharaoh being there before God. And it did not matter how intense the sign or the wonder that God demonstrated. God has created man in such a way, and this is an amazing thing. God has created man in such a way that there's nothing that God will do to violate someone's unbelief. There is nothing that can overcome that in a person. So even as you have Pharaoh, and he witnessed sign after wonder, until his own magicians, which weren't just David Copperfield, but they were workers of demonic power, said, hey, Pharaoh, you're messing with the wrong thing now. This is the finger of God. Okay? We're at the end. We've gone through our whole toolbox. We've pulled out all the stops. We're at our limit. And Moses is going beyond here. This is the finger of God. And Moses would not bend his heart. Moses continued to harden his heart. And God said, very well, you harden your heart. I will harden your heart.
You said Moses.
Oh, Pharaoh, sorry. So Pharaoh said, I will harden my heart. And God said, very well, I'll set your heart. If that's what you'll continue to do. And it's an amazing thing that when you think of all of the power of God, all of the majesty of God. And it's not that it can be undone by unbelief, but as I said, the word is hindrance. It's the thing that stops God, that prohibits God. That God, in the way that He has created and ordained creation in man, has given man that power and that ability. You cannot believe in me. If you choose, go back to the garden. You can accept my word that if the day that you eat of that, you will surely die, or you cannot believe me. And there's nothing that God can bring to bear on that soul, on that person who has set themselves in that way. He will not do it. And that should be a terrifying thing. That God will not violate a person's choice to say, I do not believe in God. And furthermore, as we see it unfolding here in these Pharisees, there is no amount of evidence. There's no amount of argument. There's no amount of debate that will change that within an individual. If their heart is set away from God, it does not matter if miracles that have never happened before happen before their very eyes. It does not matter if God moves and works in manners and ways that have just never been thought of before. If their heart is set to be against God, God says very well, I won't overcome that in you. As this man testifies here, he says, have you ever heard of anything like this? They're questioning, they're uncertain, they investigate further, but when it comes down to it, they will find a way to reject the absolute divine nature of what has just happened. And there's nothing that can or will be done to overcome that. There's no argument that will be mounted against it. It is simply the status, and it is the question that you've hindered God. What kind of God does that? What kind of God says, I have all of this, and it is absolute, everything is at my disposal. I speak and it exists, and I pull back my hand and it fails. But I've created in man this ability to reject me. And I will not overcome that. It's man's free will. You do not want to believe in me? You will not believe in me. And it's just a matter of facing. It's not a matter of degrees, but it's the direction in which a heart faces. And if a heart faces towards God, He'll reinforce the belief. Remember the man, after Jesus came down the mountain of Transfiguration, he comes down and he encounters his disciples, and he encounters the Pharisees, and he encounters the scribes, all sitting around discussing the man and his son. And his son was possessed by a demon, and they're no doubt having a lively theological discussion, all the while this man's son goes on and being possessed by a demon. And Jesus comes up and he begins to settle the matter. And he begins to explain to them that you can debate all day long the origins and all of these things, much like we have here when he stops the discussion with his disciples. And he says, here's the deal. I'm going to work or I'm not. All of your discussion and all your philosophizing and all of that doesn't change the fact that no one among you has any power over this. And Jesus begins to ask questions of the Father. And inevitably comes to the place where the Father says, I do believe somewhat, but please help me in my unbelief. I'm facing towards God in this, and I'm saying, God, I do believe, but I know that I don't believe as fully as I should. God will work with that all day long. But to the heart that is turned the other way, as these Pharisees are right here, and says, I won't believe. I will continue to give you the idea, and I will continue to lead you on, that if you answer my next question correctly, that's really where it all hinges, and I will actually believe. The discussion will never be ending. And so it really is a matter of the heart. If the heart is turned towards God and says, I don't fully understand it all, as we see with Nicodemus coming and having that heart towards God and saying, Rabbi, please explain these things to me. Jesus continues with him. But it's just a frightening portrait of these people here who will go through time and time again, who will extend themselves to conjure up all types of arguments that allow them to never have to submit to God, because that is the end of unbelief. The end of unbelief is just pride. Because that's the thing that comes undone. That's the string that unravels the whole blanket, is this: to confess that there's a God, to confess that you are not him. To confess that there's some order over you. And that's exactly what's at the heart here of the Pharisees, because for them to confess that Jesus was the Christ was to confess that he was the Son of God, was to confess that he had all authority, which was to confess that every point that he nailed them on and said that they were wrong was absolutely valid, and that therefore had no standing before God. It's a heavily invested question. It's not a matter of theological discussion for these guys. Everything that they built their life upon would come unraveled, but admitting that Christ was God. Admitting that Jesus was the Christ. Consider with me from Psalm 78. You don't have to turn there. I'll find it for you. But again, it's just a striking passage. Psalm 78, verse 41. Psalm 78 is a recounting of Israel's history with the exhortation to remember God's goodness and kindness, much like Psalm 106. And it's written by a psalm writer who understands God's long-suffering mercy. There are one of two ways that we look back on our life, and we either look back on it and think, wow, God got such an amazing deal, or we look back upon it and say, my word, how did he bear with me in such patience after decade and after decade of my obstinance? The writer of Psalm 78 is of the latter. He looks back over Israel's history in a very frank and a very sober manner, and the only conclusion he can come to is the only reason that Israel exists or ever has existed is the mercy of God, and all of that to lead up to the verse I want to quote, which is Psalm 78:41. Again, it's a history of Israel, and listen to what happens. Yes, again and again they tempted God, and they limited the Holy One of Israel. By the rebellion, and he lists a number of them in there, by the rebellion in the wilderness, by their unwillingness to go in to possess the land, by all of these things, all of the power of God was hindered, was stopped, was limited. Cut off. Instantaneous. Now to think, how could you arm wrestle with God and win? How could you negate all of the power of God? Psalm 78:41. Yes, again and again they tempted God, and they limited the Holy One of Israel. So it is here with these Pharisees. They give the guise and they give the appearance. We want to investigate a little further. We want to go on. But ultimately what it comes up against, and we'll move ahead into that a little bit, they are hindering God. It says elsewhere in Mark records that Jesus went into a village and he wanted to do miracles. He wanted to heal. He wanted to do the works of God. But he says he could do no great works there. Why? Because of their unbelief. It is the one thing. It is the one thing hinders. So again, they give the appearance that we're investigating a little further. They give the appearance that we're verifying these things. But Jesus has purposely performed a miracle, just as he did with the man at the pool of Bethesda, because his command to that man was this: rise, take up your bed, and walk. And that was a direct violation of what they considered to be the Sabbath law at that time. We had the original Ten Commandments, we had the original worship law, all of those things. And of course what they did is, as we've said before, what they did is they sat there and they thought, that can't be what it means. So let's codify it until we get it down to a place where we can actually obey it. It'll be strenuous, it'll be hard, but at least it'll be doable. That's exactly what the Pharisees set about doing. The whole purpose of the law, as we'll see as we move into the next section, the whole purpose of the law was to point and to highlight and to illustrate to man, this is how far you are off from my nature. Therefore, you need some covering for it. And ultimately, to be in fellowship with me forever, you need some reconciliation of it. But just as he did with the man at the pool of Bethesda, he does here. He, as it says, John records very clearly, verse 14. Now it was the Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. Making clay, that's labor. That's a prohibitive action on the Sabbath. Did Jesus need to make clay? Don't get caught up in the clay as well. As you look down further into what they do, verse 26, and he said to them, what did he do to you? How did he open his eyes? Those are always the two questions of religion, the what and the how. and they completely leave out the who. They want to focus on the act and what happened exactly in this, and they completely leave the fact that, it really doesn't matter if he made me jump through hula hoops. The point is that by the work of Jesus Christ, I was blind and now I see. The method he chose, to a certain extent, is irrelevant. But in this particular context, it's very purposeful. Because let's move on to the next section, which is this. Law and grace. Flesh and the Spirit. Why did Jesus perform miracles in such a way that violated what they thought obedience to God was, yet did works that only God could do? Jesus could have done this in any manner of way, but he did it in a specific way that said, here is the miracle, miraculous, divine, intervening power of God, and it breaks your rule. To force upon them a question. To confront them with the fact that one of these two can't be true. One of these has to be wrong. As the testimony always comes back to and centers, as this man says, he goes, I don't know if he's a sinner or not, but have you ever heard of anything? Have you ever heard of such a thing from even time beginning? A man healing someone who was born blind. Let's leave your discussion about the little rule and how he did it. But their primary concern, the thing that they are just stirred up about and angry about, is this. He demonstrated the power of God while violating the rule of man. How dare he? And this is what Christ is forcing upon them. But think about the nature of the law for a moment. Think about its limitations, and its limitations are this that Christ demonstrates so clearly. The law cannot create. The law cannot restore. The law is prohibitive. If you have seen perhaps in a city or even in an agricultural area where they're trying to stop erosion, and they put up all types of soil control. Maybe in a city where, that just develops, a sinkhole develops, and the best they can do is just clear out the houses that are around it, try to shore it up. Even in downtown, we have a sidewalk that's collapsing. Well, what can we do? We can stop it from collapsing. But it does nothing to undergird it or support it. And that is the nature of the law. The law, at best, can put the barrier around the thing and can stop it and can brace it and can cut it off and can, in a way, isolate it, but it can never actually restore. Romans chapter 8, Paul writes this. For what the law could not do in that it was weak through the flesh, God did by sending his own Son. In the likeness of sinful flesh, on account of sin, he condemned sin in the flesh, that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us who walk according to the flesh, not according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. The law has no restorative power. The law, for everyone who would go after enacting it and doing it, just as we see here in these two examples, not carrying your bedroll could not heal the man of his infirmity. Not making clay, very well, you keep their interpretation of the Sabbath, but it doesn't give the man back his sight, or give him his sight to begin with. And that's the nature of the law. If you begin today and you dedicate your life, and absolutely, if you have the most pugnacious will, and you are the most stubborn of people, and you can exert the most force to fight all that you know to be wrong, it does not take care of yesterday. It does not deal with the actual nature of the problem, which is a deficiency which is so clearly pointed out for us in this illustration. The man was born blind. He had never seen. And so, in the keeping of the law, if Jesus had kept the law, very well, it won't make clay. But what does that have to do with the man's sight? And so he's forcing this question. He's deliberately saying, watch me break your interpretation of the Sabbath. And while I am breaking your interpretation of the Sabbath, watch me work the works of God. Watch me restore this man to the fullness of what God would have him to be. that's the limit of it. He purposely breaks their interpretation and their rule to force upon him the question, which is it? You guys keep everything that you keep by your own will. You keep everything that you keep by your own force and by your own power. You keep everything that you keep by your own nature. And yet that man was still blind, and the man at the pool was still lame. So it doesn't require something else. Isn't the emphasis on the wrong syllable? Isn't it in the wrong place? And that's what Christ came to do, and that's what he came to force upon them. But again, they were unbelieving. They had too much to lose. They are heavily invested. And as a reminder, every person is heavily invested in their viewpoint of the world. It doesn't matter if they say they don't even have one. They're heavily invested in that. And to overcome that, and to encounter anyone here this morning who says, I don't have a particular view of the world. Yes, you do. You have a way that orders your day. You have a reason that you get out of bed. You have a reason you go to bed. You have a reason that you do things on Tuesday. You have a reason you do things on Saturday. Everybody believes that the life flows according to some purpose or some way. And encountering Christ inevitably upsets that. As he says back in chapter 7, verse 24, do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. Think this through. Consider it. And that's what he's putting upon them. And lastly, I want to look at the last theme. The first being unbelief, being characterized by hindrance of God. The second being law and grace, or flesh and the spirit. And that is characterized by the word ability. The law can't do, the law could not do what Christ did. And lastly, it's union with Christ. And the word that I want to use for that is value. The end result of Jesus intervening in this man's life was an isolation from all this man had known. Look at the last part. Starting with verse 27. He answered them, I told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? Then they reviled him and said, you are his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. Note the word that they reviled him. We know that God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, we do not know where he is from. The man answered and said to them, why, this is a marvelous thing that you do not know where he is from. Yet he has opened my eyes. Now we know that God does not hear sinners. But if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. Since the world began, it has been unheard that anyone opened the eyes of one who was born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. They answered and said to him, you were completely born in sins, and you are teaching us? And they cast him out. Slightly earlier, we were told that his parents wouldn't answer the question. It doesn't say they didn't know. It says that they feared the Jews, because their unbelief, becoming so staunch and so entrenched, always, that heart will always lead to fear, and that heart will always lead to influence others in the same way. They had exerted all of their pressure upon others, and what they had threatened them with was excommunication. You say that this guy Jesus, you give him one word of positive, then you say that he's the Christ, and you are out. We will revoke your membership. And I say that in light terms, but to think in those terms and to say what they were saying is, we will dismiss you, we will cut you off, you will be as a Gentile, you will be as dead to us. And that is not just some type of club that they were all a part of. This was the synagogue of God. This was the worship of the living God. And what they were saying to them was this. As they looked at him, and no doubt there was that piercing stare that reminded those parents, maybe even the father began to stumble it out. Well, he said something about, you know what, he's of age. Why don't you ask him? And the reason that they backed off, you would think that they would be excited. You would think that of all of the hopes they had had for their little boy over the years, you would think of all the times, and I'm localizing it a bit here, but all of the times that the father had wanted to play catch with the son, all of the things, all of the hopes that he'd had for his son, all of the things that he had to bury when he walked by his son and said, you know what, the man's of this many years of age, and all I can hope for him is that he doesn't get mugged while he's begging. All of those have been changed in an instant. There was no lack of the realism or the validity of the miracle, but when it came time, the value of that boy seeing was not the same for the father as it was for the son. So when push came to shove, and it came to you, if you confess that Christ is the one who did this, and that you agree with your son that he has the valid power of God, then the only thing we can do with you is dismiss you. The father balked. He came up short. Why? Because though it was a wonderful miracle, and though it was an amazing miracle, it wasn't his miracle. Even the proximity of a father having hopes for his son, even that type of relationship comes up short when it comes to realizing the actual miracle, which was this. Born blind, Jesus intervened, now I see. That's why in this story, the only man who actually says it and says it clearly and says it boldly and says it unashamedly and says it just defilingly against all of their authority is the man who was actually healed. All other associations, even 1 degree, even the intimacy that a father would have with his son, all of that isn't the same as the man seeing himself. And so when it came time for this, when the push came to shove, and it was not just a matter of, we will kick you out of our synagogue, you can skip down the street and find another. No. Think of all the implications of this. This was the main involvement in place of all of their life. Everyone was involved in this synagogue. It was not a matter of, I'll go find another. You were out. You were being cut off. And even threatened with that, it is the nature of the value of the miracle directly for the man that allows the man to just, as we read and we all got a bit of an excitement and a bit of a chuckle and a bit of a yeah, as he responded to them. And he had his finger directly on their issue and said, do you too want to be his disciple? How do you have that boldness? How do you have that ability to speak even to these men? It's no question in their mind. He knows. He's burned his ship. He does not care. Why? Because he was born blind. Because Jesus intervened with him. And because he now sees. It did not have the value for any other person. And there's nothing that you could do to strip that away from this man. And that's how he was brought into union with Christ. Everything that he had, all of the people that he had known, think again, his whole life was based upon begging. He lived, he existed. Everything that he had came simply at others being merciful to him. That was his role in the society. That was his role among all of the people that he knew at that synagogue. I am here that you might just show me some mercy, and my sustenance might come from you being gracious to me. He had been completely dependent upon every other person in that. And just by this act of Christ, he's now at the place of saying, keep it. Very well, I have nothing. I have no one. You kicked me out, you cut me off. I'm not on my own. But the value of that independence, the value of the result of what Christ had done in his life outweighed all of the benefits of association with every other person he knew. Now, I want to bring into your mind a great danger that we have today. And that is this. As I wanted to point and I wanted to bring out and I wanted to stress the fact that miracle only had the lasting value for that man. He alone was the one who said, yes, absolutely, it was this man, Jesus, you cannot change my mind. I don't care what pressure you buried on me. I don't care what you do to me. You cannot change this fact. I was born blind. Jesus intervened, and now I see. You could not argue with him. Why? Because God had dealt with him. And I want to bring to you to the question this morning. And I want to bring you to the exhortation. I want to bring you to the challenge. And I want to bring you to the warning. And it's this. If God, in the person of Jesus Christ, has not so dealt with you yet, don't go around saying that he has. Don't succumb to the other side of the pressure, to the possibility of embarrassment, to the problem that everyone wants you to feel a certain way or to react a certain way. I've been going to church for so many years. I've been to so many Bible studies or prayer meetings or what have you. This is a very clear and it is a very definitive thing that Christ did. He took a man who had never seen before. He worked in his life and then he saw, and we'll see the unfolding of that next week. But my point is this. When push comes to shove, when the enemy works influence and brings to bear that kind of test on an individual, where every person in that person's life, even the ones who say, we worship God, what is your problem? Why are you so all about this? Just calm down a bit. When that comes down, if you do not have that personal value of the miracle, and those situations will reveal whether you are within 1 or 2 degrees of the actual miracle, or if you yourself can testify in that moment to say, I don't care what you say. I was blind. I lived my life in blindness. I lived my life not being able to see. Christ intervened, and now I see. And I don't need anything else. I will take it. I would love to be friends. I would love to be in fellowship. I would love to be part of the family. But when push comes to shove, if you make the call, here it is. There is nothing to change that value in my life. You cannot unsettle that value, because that means more to me than all of the pennies that everyone else in the world has ever tossed into my cup. And if that hasn't happened, if the realization of encountering Christ isn't that clear, that I was blind and Christ worked and now I see, listen to me, dear people, don't go around pretending to see. There's nothing macho in that. There's nothing that's applaudable in that. Because then you fall into a completely different type, but very similar way of Phariseeism. Yes, Christianity is supposed to be this, and it looks like that, and I'm doing these things. But all of it will come undone, because if this man had just come back and still been blind, but tried to operate as though he weren't, it would be a very short time before he walked into a wall, or stumbled over the root, or dropped the pitcher. It has to be real. And if it isn't real, make it real. Christ is talking about doing real things here. He's not talking about, I'm going to, I think I was blind, and I think I've come to Christ, and now I think I see. It's definitive for this man. And I'm not saying that to shame anyone, and I'm not saying that to trouble anyone, unless in the best way. Because inevitably life will come about, the enemy will work it, and God will allow it to bring it to bear in our life, that question. And if it isn't real, if he really hasn't worked in our life in that way, and in that manner, and in that severity, if he really hasn't done it, then we will acquiesce, and we will be the parents, and we'll say, I knew a guy, and he just went too far off the edge. He used to be the worst guy around town. You just didn't do anything with him. And then something happened, but I'm not quite sure. Why don't you go ask him? That is the nature of one who's encountered Christ. Now here's the thing. It doesn't mean that anyone can't encounter Christ in that manner. If I were to stop right there and say if it hasn't happened, tough luck. Too bad. No. My point is this. It must be real. Because at the end, in whatever way, and however it comes about, you will have to be alone with Christ. And if what he's done in your life is real. There will not be any other association, any other offer, any other consideration that will be able to separate you from them. Because he's worked. Because the miracle is real and it is that valuable. You cannot have anyone else's miracle. You cannot have anyone else's vision. You cannot have anyone else's record. Why? Because inevitably, those two things will be in the scales. Everything that you know and have, or being alone with Christ. And if he hasn't worked, inevitably the scale will fall this way. It doesn't matter if it's happened 10 times before in your life. It doesn't matter where you are today. It's just my exhortation. I mean it as an exhortation. I mean it as a wonderful encouragement. I mean it because you may be sitting here today and say, I've always wondered what this thing was about. And it lacks that value that I see demonstrated in that man. Because in the end, it's not about this man being brave. It's not about this man being a real stand-up guy. It's about this man just speaking the truth and saying, I don't care what you say. You cannot change my mind. You can't bring anything to bear on me. Why? Because it actually happened, and I really see. And that's the exhortation today. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your willingness to work in any and all of our lives. Lord, however I have muddled your word today, however I have just muddied it and clouded it, Lord, I pray by your grace to bring but just a grain of it through, a ray of it through, Lord, that your work would be in our hearts. And wherever we are, Lord, I pray that we would desire that. And if you have worked in our life in that manner, God, it is so clear that we were blind and Christ intervened and now we see. And we know that no keeping of the law could have ever done that it needed him to work. Lord, if we were there, may we recall it today. May we take moments out of our day to just think it over again. And to even weigh in our hearts to all of the associations and the pity and the mercy and the alms of the world. If I segregate myself from them, if they shove me away, is the miracle that real that it doesn't matter? And that's that method, Lord, by which you bring us into union with your Son. And I thank you. I thank you for every person here, Lord, and I pray that you would bless them and keep them in your mighty power, that we would not hinder you, Lord, with unbelief. And for all those, Lord, who are of our company who aren't here this morning, I pray that you would bless them and keep them and give us opportunity to exhort them towards Christ.